Ça marche? Oui. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. Merci d'être présentes et présents à cet événement du Club suisse de la presse. Au nom de la directrice du club, Isabelle Falconier, et en mon nom, je vous souhaite la bienvenue et je vous remercie de votre présence. Je souhaite aussi remercier toutes les personnes qui sont en ligne avec nous aujourd'hui. Nous allons parler aujourd'hui d'une question tragique qui sont les féminicides et quelles mesures pourraient être prises, ou peuvent être prises, ou sont prises au niveau national et international. J'ai le plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui Mme Kareen Jabre. Vous êtes la directrice des programmes de l'Union interparlementaire, l'Organisation mondiale des parlements dont le siège est à Genève. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Nous accueillons aussi Monsieur Alfonso Barragues. Vous êtes le conseiller en relations extérieures du Fonds des Nations Unies pour la population. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui, monsieur. Soyez le bienvenu. Nous avons aussi Mme Brigitte Leoni. Vous êtes réalisatrice d'un documentaire fort intéressant qui s'appelle Norma et vous allez nous expliquer l'histoire de Norma et pourquoi son cas est emblématique. Nous avons avec nous aussi en ligne aujourd'hui deux personnes. Nous avons Mme Adriana Quinones. Vous êtes la cheffe du département Droits, humain et développement à ONU Femmes. Bonjour madame. J'espère que vous êtes connectés avec nous. Bonjour, hello, on vous voit, merci beaucoup. Et nous avons aussi Mme Isabelle Santagostino. Vous êtes une experte sur la violence contre les femmes à la Banque mondiale. J'espère que nous vous voyons aussi. Bonjour Isabelle, merci d'être avec nous. Si vous le permettez, mesdames et messieurs, je vais m'exprimer maintenant en anglais puisque la grande partie de nos intervenantes et notre intervenant sont plutôt anglophones. So I switch it into English. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us today. Perhaps I will start with you, Mrs. Kareen Jabre, and asking you what does the Interparliamentary Union regarding the question of violence against women?
Thank you very much, Luisa, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to contribute to this debate on behalf of the IPU. And just to put it very to answer your question directly, the Global Organization of National Parliaments, the IPU, works for democracy for everyone. And at the core of our work is actually the promotion of gender equality. And the reason for that is that very many years ago, we have made the link between democracy and women's capacity to take part freely in decision-making processes. This is one of the key, elements of democracy. And for us, this means that women should be able to live free from violence and be able to, again, express themselves and take part in the management of public affairs. This is at the heart of democracy. So the IPU has been engaged for many years now in efforts to support combating violence against women, and in particular through parliaments and their powers and their role. So we're talking about femicide today, which is the intentional murder of women because they are women. And we know, thanks to, again, UN Women, UNODC, WHO, and so many researchers, UNFPA, that are conducted, that most cases of femicide today are committed by partners or ex-partners or people that are familiar with the victim herself. So around 55% of cases come from this environment. And femicides also involve ongoing abuse in the home, threats, intimidation, sexual violence, and situations where women are often in a disadvantage in terms of power relations, but also in terms of resources with regard to their partner. So I'm saying this because femicide doesn't come out of nowhere most of the time. It is part of a bigger environment, and it is unfortunately the deadly end of a continuum of multiple interwoven and interconnected forms of gender-based violence. So it's a very complex subject. It's with multiple dimensions and multiple responses, and it is also a global phenomenon that no policymaker today in the world can ignore or refuse to engage in. So this is why the IPU, as I said, is very keen on supporting parliaments in making the difference or contributing to those efforts to combat violence against women and femicide. And I guess the first answer, it's not the only answer, and there's so many others, but I'll focus on this one. It's first and foremost to build legal frameworks that, set the basis for combating, preventing, and addressing violence against women and femicide. Now, it's part of the puzzle. It's not the only piece. And we have seen, due to the complexity of the issue, that it's not a question of having one law. It's about building a framework that will address those different components of femicide. And so it's about, combating violence against women. It's also about combating gender discrimination, which are conducive also to this inequality between men and women, and which also facilitate such crimes. So based on UN Women data, we know, for instance, that there are multiple legislation around the world that address violence against women. 162 countries have passed laws on domestic violence. 147 have laws on sexual harassment, for instance, in the workplace. With regard to femicide, we know that most of the countries actually use their general criminal law provisions on homicide to address femicide per se, applying maybe harsher sentences where there are aggravating circumstances in such cases as the killing of a spouse or a pregnant woman. Other countries have actually adopted specific provisions on femicide, and this is mainly in the Latin American countries, and I think we'll come back to those, where there is the crime of femicide per se that is defined, and this is definitely a step forward in making this an important issue that needs to be addressed specifically and with much more vigor. Now, I guess my message more generally in terms of legal frameworks, and for us the role of parliaments, is that we need to build a comprehensive framework that looks at the different components of violence against women and femicide. We need first and foremost strong laws that will, against homicides resulting from intimate partner violence, against murders that are following rape, against so-called honor crimes, for instance, dowry-related murders and other types of murders related to women, even within the context of human trafficking, armed conflicts, gangs, etc. That's the first point. The second point, the legislation itself should not allow for perpetrators to escape criminal responsibility on the basis of passion, honor, provocation, or violent emotion. So this is another key element of legal frameworks that needs to be considered. And the third one, I think the emphasis of legal frameworks should also focus on the victims themselves. As I said, femicide is the result of the end of the road, and there is all of this additional work that can be done to prevent gender-based violence, to protect victims, to allow them to have access to services and to address their needs, but also to put in place systems through the police and justice that will also help, again, put this framework together to protect victims. I'll end here in terms with one note saying that laws, as I said, are not enough. It's part of a puzzle. Laws are only good if they are implemented. This means budgets. This means mechanisms. This means monitoring and follow-up. It means political support. It means cultural change. It means so many things that we need to take into account. But maybe 2 points. One, we cannot do things alone, and all of this really requires a multi-stakeholder approach and giving space to women themselves so that they can speak out and contribute and be part of also of the decision making. That's the first point. And second, we see new forms of violence that are coming up, which we need to monitor. For the part of the IPU, we are very much concerned by the violence against women in politics and women parliamentarians, which in some cases has also resulted in murder. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We can also mention the question of impunity, which is also one of the factors. Now, I would like to ask you, Mr. Barragues, your organization has just published a very important report. Can you tell us more about this report, specifically focusing on violence against women and girls?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, this event is very timely because it has coincided with the launch of our annual flagship report, to which the media organizations and outlets in Geneva accredited to the UN were invited. So maybe some of you were at the press conference we organized the day of the launch on the 17th of April. This is the report, Interwoven Lives, Threads of Hope, which is considering the 30 years since the adoption of the International Conference on Population and Development. Let me tell you first who is UNFPA. No? UNFPA is a development agency, one UN development agency, a rights-based agency, and at the core of our mandate is this agenda of the International Conference on Population and Development adopted 30 years ago in Cairo to place the rights of people to sexual and reproductive health, freedom from discrimination, coercion and violence in exercising bodily autonomy at the core of sustainable development. With a very clear message, sustainable development will not be fully achieved, and that includes, of course, women benefiting from sustainable development unless those rights are upheld, respected and protected. So the report is taking stock of what has happened in the last 30 years and the way forward, what still needs to happen. And of course, there's a lot to celebrate in 30 years. Mme Kareen already in her intervention mentioned a number of elements that have progressed in the last 30 years, especially at the legal level. When we are talking about more than 162 countries adopting legislation on domestic violence, then we need to break it down to see exactly how the issue of gender-based violence, and more specifically femicide, is considered within those laws, which is a more, it's a different picture. But still, there's been a much higher political commitment. Nevertheless, the report also acknowledges the fact that gender-based violence, and femicide in particular, is the more pervasive form of gender-based violence that is grounded, or at the root of it is that it is grounded in oppressive structures such as patriarchal systems, which basically treat women as secondary, as subordinate to men, even as the property of men still in many contexts today. And this is probably the main factor which explains why gender-based violence and even femicide, being such a severe form of violence that results in the death of a woman, are still normalized in societies. No, they are still considered to be something normal or something that results in impunity due to this culture of silence, this culture of acceptance of this form of violence. Also, femicide and gender-based violence in general is a phenomenon that happens in every society and every context. No cultural setting, no country, no society is totally free from it. No, it is very important to state that it's not just an issue affecting developing nations, it is a worldwide phenomenon. But the report also highlights how, despite progress, there are still very gross inequalities that need to be addressed, that we are still leaving many women and girls behind. The three main factors of exclusion would be related to intersecting discrimination on the basis of age, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And I would add to that also the situation faced by women and girls in humanitarian situations, where the pre-existing inequalities are further exacerbated by conflict and the fragility of protection systems. Just to give you an element of information, when we're talking about women with disabilities, they can be up to 10 times more likely to experience gender-based violence compared to women without a disability. Even men and boys with disabilities are confronted to violence on the basis of disability higher than men and boys without disabilities. So how to respond to this problem, because we are also looking at the way forward. UNFPA, together with UN Women, and Adriana is certainly going to talk about that, is leading UN agencies in a global response to gender-based violence and femicide, which comprises a continuum of services from prevention, protection, coordination, data, and response services. It is very important to talk about this continuum of services, and when we talk about prevention, for instance, access to sexual and reproductive health services is a fundamental component. Why? Because usually many cases of gender-based violence are first identified when a woman reaches out to a health center by a health professional. This is related to the culture of silence and normalization I was talking about. Many women still don't come forward to denounce cases of violence, which if remain undenounced may end up resulting in femicide. So the continuum of services is fundamental for that. Addressing these patriarchal structures that perpetrate gender-based violence also requires a set of actions. For instance, increasing access to sexuality education in school settings and also out of school, so that boys and girls from that early age already understand power imbalances in terms of gender relations and the need for healthy relations and positive masculinities. So in our continuum of services, we emphasize a lot men engagement at the community level, what we call cultural actors, like religious leaders, traditional leaders, and those actors at the community level that are a fundamental piece in perpetuating or challenging those prevailing social and negative gender and social norms that perpetuate gender-based violence and femicides. In terms of response measures and from a legal perspective, already Kareen alluded to that, so I don't need to further emphasize, but definitely while laws are important, they are not the only solution. They need to be complemented with other measures. I wanted just to finish talking about data, the importance of data, because that's one aspect UNFPA is leading on. We believe that it is important to visibilize femicide. Femicide still remains highly invisible in official statistics, either because it is clouded under broader denominations of homicide, which do not disaggregate by murders where gender is a factor explaining the murder. It is better measured in home settings. That's why we have a lot of data on intimate partner violence, which actually, as Kareen indicated, reveals that 58% of gender-based violence occurs in those settings. Therefore, home would be the most dangerous place for women. We need to be also very mindful of that in crafting responses to the problem. But still, we need data to know better what happens outside of homes. Know when murders are perpetrated in other spaces, to be able to understand the gender dimension of those phenomena in order, again, to craft policy responses that could address the phenomenon more accurately. So UNFPA is promoting the use of civil registration and vital statistics systems as the most reliable way to collect data, not just through surveys but through established administrative data systems that will collect data on births, deaths, causes of death, so that we can understand better how femicide occurs in different societies. Still, there's a lot of way to go, but that's where we are concentrating our effort and also where we're mobilizing donor support in order to build those systems. We are currently the custodians for the Center of Excellence of Civil Registration and Vital Statistics. And I will, of course, we are talking about a serious human rights violation, but also the report makes the investment case that little investment in reducing gender-based violence, we are talking about 80 billion US dollars, would have a maximum return of more than $600 billion. So I think that also from that perspective, when we talk about investing in sexual and reproductive health and rights, investing in the bodily autonomy of women and the prevention of femicides and gender-based violence, this is necessary way to go in order to fulfill the title of the report, Interwoven Lies, Threads of Hope. Know how we can work together in achieving the final eradication of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you. You have mentioned Mrs. Adriana Quinones. She's with us, I hope. Madame Quinones, Adriana, are you with us? We don't see you. Yes. Perfect. Thank you very much for being with us today also. Madame Quinones, you are the head of UN Women here in Geneva. You are not in Geneva today because you are on mission, but you are going to tell us more about the mandate of UN Women and specifically regarding violence against women and girls.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm very sorry I cannot be with you today. This is a topic that I've worked for a long time as regional advisor for ending violence against women in the Panama regional office. And really, I would like to thank all the previous panelists because they have set the stage of the complexity of this issue and all the different things that need to come together to address femicide as the last situation in a chain of events that leads to women being murdered because of being women. So what I would share with you is that for the first time, the European Union had a major investment on ending violence against women through the Spotlight Initiative. This was a $500 million investment that started in 2015 with the promise of creating the momentum at different levels to supporting what was relevant in different regions. So, for example, in the Asia region, the efforts by several UN agencies, governments, and civil society have to do with trafficking in persons. In other countries in Africa, they are about domestic violence, but in Latin America, it is about addressing femicide. And this comes from the demand of the women's movement that came together really demanding a solution for the systematic murder of women. We see in Brazil, for example, many cases of Afro-descendant women, human rights defenders, women who are organized in social movements. We saw all the situation of women in Mexico, women who were in a particular situation of vulnerability, working in maquilas, in non-formal jobs, exposed to all kinds of vulnerabilities and being killed systematically. But what was incredible was to see the rage of these murders, the viciousness, women cut into pieces, women raped in the most horrific forms. So it's a hate crime, and it is also a crime that requires the response of the state. And so this is why the feminist movement in Latin America, but particularly in Mexico, came up with this request that we speak about femicide, because it's not just the murder of women, but it's the murder of women with the collaboration, explicit or implicit, of the state, by not having adequate services, by not having prevention programs, by not funding those policies that would allow for gender equality. And so this has been the greatest line of work. And in Latin America, we have the pioneering regional convention on ending violence against women and girls, the Belém do Pará, already almost 30 years old. This convention has a monitoring and evaluation framework common to all the countries. So this allows us, as Alfonso was mentioning, as the other colleagues were mentioning, to really be able to compare with data. It's the request and the demand to compile data to inform on efforts. And this is when we can start to see the trends of what's working and what's not working. So based on that, we put together with the participation and the comparative advantage of all the agencies working in this field, a theory of change that begins with legislation. We put together with the Belém do Pará Convention colleagues at the OAS a model legislation on femicide that looked at the problems and the issues of the first legislation. We had the first legislation by Costa Rica in 2007. And the issue of that law, as pioneering and positive that it was, it only applies to the current partner. And so what we saw is that prior partners of the victim can also commit femicide, and they're not covered by this legislation. The absolute difficulties of getting the data and investigating with a gender perspective were also noted. But I want to share with you that these collective efforts allowed from having 8 countries with a specialized legislation on femicide to now a place where we have 16, twice the number, and many more legislations that are being provided. The importance of the legislation has implications on the data collection, the investigation, the services provided, whether prevention is part or not. The legislation in Colombia, for example, includes a very important paragraph on the role of schools and prevention. And so each legislation is adding to the theory of change of what works. UN Women has also produced with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights a protocol for the investigation of femicide with a gender perspective, because we need to understand the previous patterns of violence. We need to understand the role of each of the officials in the justice system, not only the prosecutor, but all the forensics, how a crime scene is taken care of. It's looking at all the different details that will allow for a proper investigation, that will not re-victimize the family, that will not blame the woman who was murdered, but rather that it looks comprehensively at the rights of the survivors in the family, at the history of violence and how the state was able to respond or not, what were the different coordination mechanisms that we're still working very hard on this. But this model for the investigation of femicide has been now appropriated at the regional level. And I cannot stress the importance of this, because when we are working with common tools, we are able to create a critical mass of understanding what this phenomena is about, what works and what doesn't work. I think the most critical, there are elements in each step, but this theory of change also included the women's movement, with increased resources for women's organizations who are usually closer to the victims and can provide knowledge, information, services that could save lives. So this is a comprehensive theory of change when we look at the individual, the relationship, the family, the community, the institutions. We saw with great surprise how, for example, some of the surveys that were done in Latin American countries tend to blame the victims because they were wearing a miniskirt, because they were coming out late at night. And even if it's 2024, these social norms persist. So this tells us how this, phenomena has to be worked from the different levels, and all the persons involved in an investigation need to be trained and held accountable for looking at the situation of women, understanding conditions of discrimination that already our panelists mentioned, to be able to advance justice, to create a notion in society that these crimes will not be tolerated. I want to share with you that the greatest advancements in investigation, in understanding this phenomena have come from mothers of women who have been murdered and who have not seen justice and who have taken on the efforts leading even to sentences of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, of mandatory reparations. And so it's incredible the opportunity we have today to listen about the efforts that women who are not rich, who are not highly educated, have taken on the role of accountability and have advanced for the benefit of all of us the importance of gender equality in investigations. And I think that's where we can start making strides to progress. But as mentioned by all my panelists, this is about gender equality. This is about the conditions for women living a life where all the aspects of their life, the economic, the social, the political, the participation, are protected. And so that's why we all need to work together. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for your intervention. You have mentioned Mexico, you have mentioned mothers, and we have with us today Mrs. Brigitte Leoni. You are a journalist, you are also a director, and you have produced a very interesting documentary called Norma. Can you tell us more about Norma? Why you choose this specific case?
Okay, first, thank you for inviting me today. I think what Adriana was saying resonates a lot, you know, on the case of Norma, because Norma is a Mexican mother. She is a teacher as well. She was a teacher. And in 2001, a daughter, Alejandra, was kidnapped. And after she disappeared, and she was actually killed, and she was part of what we call now the feminicidios in Ciudad Juárez. You know, the number of feminicides that happened in Ciudad Juárez, in Chihuahua. There were many actually in 1995. I think we were talking at the time in 2001 about 400 cases. And those women were killed, as Adriana was saying, sometimes because they were working in maquilas, so they were not protected. Maquilas are factories that are assembly lines, and but not all of them. I mean, others were students, others were working, you know, at home. I mean, they were cleaners. I mean, they had all kind of jobs. And Norma is really, I mean, here it's back to the human person, right? Because we talk about the frameworks, all the things that are actually set up and which are super useful, of course. But here we're talking, I mean, I'm telling the story of a woman who has been denied the right of justice. Mm-hmm. This woman, she didn't have access to justice. She tried, you know, from the very beginning, as Adriana was saying, you know, I mean, her daughter was killed. She tried to go to the police, and the police said, no, you need to come back in 48 hours because, you know, not now. Maybe your daughter is gone with a boyfriend or somewhere, you know, and she will come back. So they nearly blame her, you know, try to justify the fact that the daughter is not back from work. And so Norma actually tried to find out, you know, I think, who killed her daughter. First, where was her daughter? So she basically exhausted all level of, I would say, legal proceeding or legal possibilities, means that she had. You know, she tried with the municipality, with the police municipality. She tried with the state, the Chihuahua state. She tried with the federal state, Mexico, and she didn't find any solution, and nobody wanted to help her. Nobody was listening to her. So at the end, she filed a case to the commission, the Inter-American Commission for human rights. And the commission actually waited almost, I mean, this is a legal time anyway. She waited for 10 years to examine the case, to see the case. And in December last year, a case was finally accepted by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And it will be a very important step because it will be a unique chance to get a trial actually now, you know. So what I'm telling is the story of a woman who has had a double pain because she suffered the loss of her daughter, obviously, but also she had to go through an enormous process because she has been fighting for 23 years. So imagine 23 years. And she has been humiliated, she has been blamed for many things. She has been attacked twice. She nearly died, actually. She received 5 bullets, you know, because she wanted to know the truth. And I think it's just the story of an incredible, resilient woman that I am a mother, and I wish I could have done the same thing, you know, because really it's somebody who will never give up. You know, she nearly died, but she wants to continue because for her, justice is the most important thing. And she has been denied the access to justice in a country, Mexico, as you were saying, that actually recognized feminicide in its penal code. And I think it's one of the 18 countries in Latin America which have a legislation and an institutional framework on feminicide, but the problem is not enforced. And the problem is that also, I would say Mexico is a bit particular because there is a problem of impunity. I think the country is very advanced in many ways, you know, and especially as you probably know, there will be election in Mexico very soon, and we're going to have 2 female candidates. Mm-hmm. So I think gender parity exists in one way, but the justice, especially I would say, you know, implementing justice is probably a huge problem, not only actually for women, but also for men, because there are also many homicides. And so I think I was really interested. I met Norma when I was living in Mexico in 2001, and I was really moved by her story because I met her a couple of times, you know, later on. And every time she was saying to me, yes, I'm trying. I mean, my case is going on, but I still don't know who killed my daughter. And the great news happened last year, in December, as I was saying, because after 23 years, she will have a chance now to go to this court, this Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I think it's the 3rd case of feminicide that is going to be tried in Mexico, because there was a big one in 2009 with the Campo Algodonero. Campo Algodonero is a case, of 3 women who have been actually also 3 mothers who required, who asked for justice, and they got it in 2009. Mexico was condemned actually for not doing enough and not investigating, not trying to look for the murderers of the 3 women who died in 2001, because Campo Algodonero happened also in 2001, but it was condemned in 2009. So I think the question that we are asking ourselves, okay, you can have laws, and it's important, but enforcement, implementation is also, crucial. And as you said as well, it's not enough. You can have all the criminalization of feminicide in place, but you need also, to have prevention laws to actually stop the moment when the woman is going to be killed, because as we said, feminicide is the last act of violence against a woman, and it's too late, right? So we need to find other ways as well beforehand to actually condemn or punish or to find other solutions, and to deter actually any type of violence against women from the very beginning and before it's too late. And I'm saying, okay, I'm doing these things now in Mexico, but it happens that I'm living now in Italy as well, and in France. And in France, Italy, you have more than 100 feminicide as well, every year. And it's for different causes, because it's more linked to violence, domestic violence. I think in Mexico it's a bit different. They have cases of domestic violence as well, but it's a particular context linked to the drug cartels, the organized crime, so it's a different setting. And it's probably the 45% of the one that because you mentioned the 57% on domestic violence, but we don't talk a lot about the other ones who are actually perpetrated in the public sphere, which are also very, very important. Mm-hmm. So I think that, the discussion is very relevant, because I think when we think about what is happening in Europe as well, I think Germany has a high level as well, especially after COVID. I think the number of women who have been suffering from violence has been really increasing as well. So we see as well, and also the question I'm asking myself, because I think in my country, like France, feminicide is not recognized as an autonomous crime, but it's, when you kill a woman, it's an aggravating factor. So you can risk 20, 30 years of prison. Mm-hmm. But still, you still have 120, I think it's one woman is killed every 3 days by a companion in France. So it's quite a lot. So maybe penalization is not the solution. This is not also the solution. Or maybe it's not enough. Mm-hmm. Because also what I've noticed, because now I'm still working on feminicide in Europe, is that also that you can have a punishment, but this, if it's not completely done, or because I'm thinking, maybe you remember the case of Bertrand Cantat, who was a singer in France, who actually killed Nadine Trintignant in 2003, Marie Trintignant, in 2003, and I think he was condemned for 8 years, and after 4 years he was released. And at the time, back in 2003 in France, we were talking about passionate love, and we were killing women for passionate love, so this is why actually you could excuse or justify, the feminicide. And I think this fait divers, this event has changed quite a lot in France, because after that there were Grenelle, discussion, and I think now France has a number of, not laws, but they can protect better women, you see. Mm-hmm. Same with Oscar Pistorius. If you follow the news, because you're a journalist, in South Africa as well, this Paralympic athlete has been also condemned because he had killed his companion, and I think he was just freed, I think, beginning of this year on parole, because mm-hmm. when you you comply with your sentence and you have a good behavior, after 4 years you can get out of jail. So I'm not saying that, as you were saying, that, as you agree with me, we're not thinking that, obviously condemning, punishing is good, and it's not what we want, but it's part of the solution, probably, and maybe it's not enough, maybe question. Mm-hmm. So.
Thank you very much. We are trying to get in touch with Mrs. Isabelle Santagostino. Are you with us, Isabelle? I don't see you.
Here. Can you hear me?
I hear. Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for your patience. All of you have mentioned that legislation, punishment is not enough. So you are at the World Bank. Can you tell us what you think should be done? And also, you were mentioning to me when we were preparing this meeting about action that could be taken. Can you tell us more, or give us maybe some figures also?
Yes, of course. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for this kind of invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel this morning or afternoon for you. So just to give you a little bit of context, at the World Bank, I work for a project called the Women, Business and the Law, which is a project where we analyze and collect laws, regulations, and policies, but also opinions of experts in areas that are key for women's economic empowerment in 190 countries. So we look at 10 areas of laws, again, and policies, ranging from mobility, workplace, pay, parenthood, childcare, assets, pensions, just to name a few. And from this year, in our latest report, we also, which we published in March, we included a new area, which is violence against women, and under an indicator that we call the safety. So under this indicator, we look at the existence of laws on child marriage, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and femicide. And we also look at whether there are related policies and aspects related to access to justice to support the implementation of these laws. And this is because, as some of the panelists said before, laws on the books are not enough. So we realized that there are some aspects that we were not taking into account. And so again, supportive frameworks that enable their implementation are key, but also, as I mentioned, we also surveyed some experts on the ground to understand what their perceptions were, because we also realized that social norms play a key part in all this, and this is an area we're also expanding on. So, and to explain a bit, under the questions under each indicator were chosen based on evidence from economic literature and also statistically significant associations with outcomes related to women's economic empowerment, such as, for example, employment. And also we took into account the international legal framework on women's human rights, such as, for example, CEDAW, ILO conventions, etc. So when it comes specifically to violence against women, it is key, of course, to highlight that it is an unacceptable violation of human rights. Of course, it impairs the health and psychological well-being of women, their capacity to work and function socially, and it also has an impact on their children, communities, etc. But on top of this, violence against women leads to a series of direct and indirect economic costs for countries, and not only countries. So direct costs, for example, include higher expenses on police, judicial, and healthcare services, but there are also some indirect costs, which include lower productivity, decreased profitability and returns for companies, and overall high economic costs in relation to the national GDP. And these result in hundreds of billions of losses. So just to give you a few examples and a few figures, there's a study that has recently shown that an increase by 1% of the share of women subject to violence can reduce economic activities by up to a bit over 8% due to a significant drop in formal female employment. Also, there's some research that estimates that the cost of violence against women can amount up to 3.7% of GDP in some countries, which again, for some countries, it's twice the amount that they may spend in education. So therefore, addressing violence against women through legal and policy interventions as a first step could save countries millions of lives and billions of dollars every year. So for example, there's a study that shows that worldwide, having domestic violence legislation could have saved about 33 million women between 1990 and 2012. And a study in the United States showed that every dollar spent on protection orders for women has been estimated to save about $31 in avoided costs. So this is just to say that countries can promote survivors' long-term social, financial, and emotional well-being by adopting a multifaceted and collaborative approach to services such as medical and psychological support, legal aid, livelihood support, but also through prevention, so more investment in education and also addressing and targeting social norms. So in general, funding of domestic violence program is likely to be a cost-effective investment. For example, the adoption of legislation and policy measures on protection orders, including training for first responders, has been associated, according to some studies, with a reduction of abuse for many women. And also other studies have shown that women who receive services for partner abuse at shelters, domestic violence shelters, significantly improved on clinical measures of life functioning, coping ability, feeling helped and satisfaction, etc. So yeah, this is a bit to summarize, how, again, it is really important to have these laws, but also policies that include, services, mechanisms to follow up on the actual implementation of these services, but also budgets to address violence against women, which again is not, as also some panelists were saying, it is not an issue in itself. It's actually inequitable gender norms and beliefs that are the underlying drivers of GBV. So violence and harassment, violence against women doesn't happen in isolation, as it reflects power inequalities between men and women. So it is key to respond to address it through multiple areas, and by creating equality also in other areas of women's lives before it gets to the most extreme manifestation of violence.
Thank you. You have mentioned different aspects. I would like to tackle the question of a sense of impunity, because we can understand maybe that in some cases you can have a person who knows that he will face maybe 10, 15, 20 years in prison, but still this person kills or aggress his wife or a woman. What is for you the main difficulty in order to really prevent these cases of feminicide and to try to combat this sense of impunity that some men do have? And the question is for all of you. Kareen Jabre, maybe, would you like to answer?
I think all of us have touched on that. I think it's a mixture of factors. It is about, changing the culture. It is about educating. It is about, changing the gender relations and the relations between men and women, and it starts with education from the very beginning, but also throughout the life of every individual, men and women, about what should be those power relations and what should be those links, and what is again acceptable or not. It is about culture. For me, it's also about mechanisms in place that hold accountable, and we mentioned that as well, but that hold accountable those that have to implement the law, that they have the capacity as well to know how to address certain situations, to identify risks, to know where we need more protection, to know how to speak to victims, etc. And all of this is a weakness in the whole system, which allows for certain behaviors to continue to increase without being stopped before it is far too late. So for me, it is about it's a culture, and it is about systems in place that are still too weak, that are not perfected, and that need a lot of investment. And there is not sufficient investment in prevention of violence against women. It's really, assistance to victims is very important, but prevention is also another aspect that needs to be strengthened.
Mr. Barragues, do you have a comment?
Well, just
also?
to re-emphasize the issue of culture, I think that still today we live in a culture of impunity, but also a culture of normalization and acceptance, as I said in my initial intervention. And that needs to be tackled at many levels of society, community level, but also in schools. I had mentioned about sexuality education, and I think that when we talk about this issue of a culture of normalization, there was a stark evidence presented by WHO as a result of a survey conducted with young people, which shows the high level of acceptance. I don't remember the exact figure, maybe another panelist has it. I think it was around 30% of boys accepting that it was normal to beat your partner. No, if the partner went outside from home at night, or if the partner burned the food, no, or in other of the social roles that society assigns to women. So this culture of acceptance is very rooted in society. Another element I wanted to highlight is at the root of this is the issue of controlling women's bodies, women's freedom. And our report and previous reports we have issued, this State of the World Population report that we issue every year. 2 years ago, we had the report on the right to bodily autonomy, which is one of the indicators we measure in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is very interesting to note there that still today there's about 44% of women worldwide from countries where data is available that cannot exercise their bodily autonomy. They cannot make autonomous decisions on issues concerning their bodies and their health, including 1/4 of women worldwide who cannot say no to their partners if they don't want to have sex. Now, I think that is very revealing. As equally revealing it is that 1/4% of women worldwide cannot go out to a health center without seeking the partner's permission. Mm-hmm. I mean, they feel that they cannot do that without having the permission. So it is ultimately this culture that needs to be challenged. No, thank you.
Thank you. I see that there are some questions here. Paula, you would like to ask a question?
Yes, hello. My name is Paula Dupré-Lebiès. I'm a journalist here in Geneva with a number of publications, including The New Humanitarian, for which I've written a number of stories regarding the issue of gender-based violence and femicide. I wanted to get the views of all of you with the various organizations on the issue of funding. Because, of course, as we all know right now, there's been a contraction of funding generally when it comes to humanitarian assistance. And I'd like to know how you view that and where you think the funding will be coming from. Also on the national level, I mean, I know that there, you mentioned CEDAW, but I think there are other efforts. There's this Every Woman treaty that's sort of has been discussed for a number of years that deals with the issue of violence, that addresses services and response and so forth. So how do you, I mean, there doesn't seem to be right now any sort of obligation of countries to fund the types of services that you're discussing. So that's one issue. Yeah, I actually just wanted to know for the World Bank, just regarding those numbers, are those the updated, when are those economic statistics that you mentioned from, are those very recent or a few years ago?
Thank you. We will then ask Isabelle, maybe, to answer this question of funding.
Sure. Well, when it comes to funding, as mentioned, so starting this year, we started to look at whether countries also have budgetary allocations in place in order to ensure that, there are services that are functioning to address violence against women. So what we have seen is that when we consider 190 countries, there's 103 that actually have budgets in place. But something that we have not been able to tackle specifically is what is the ideal amount of budget that countries should have in place in order to address violence against women. Because we saw that many countries have actually budgetary allocations, but it seems to be a really small amount when we take into account the needs that country may have, and also how that budget is in the end used. So we saw it's used perhaps for some sensitization campaigns, such as, around perhaps March 8th, but there is so much more that actually needs to be done. So again, we saw that 103 countries have these budgets in place, but I think that more discussion is needed in terms of how much should actually be allocated. And then when it comes to the numbers that you're mentioning, so yeah, most of them are actually quite recent. When it comes to the percentage of GDP, that actually really depends on, it varies from country to country. And actually studies, show different numbers between 1 and 3. The one I mentioned talks about up to 3.7% of national GDP for countries. So it really depends. But overall, countries that have done studies to calculate the cost of gender-based violence have seen that it's always above 1% of national GDP, the cost. So it is definitely important. It's actually an investment to allocate budget for gender-based violence for the prevention of gender-based violence, because in the long term, it actually reduces a lot the costs for countries.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Mr. Barragues.
Yeah, no, I wanted to emphasize two things. One, as we were saying initially, gender-based violence is a form of human rights violation. Mm-hmm. And when this is considered human rights violations, the states have obligations to put in place all the measures necessary in order to prevent those violations from occurring, and in order to take actions once the violations have occurred. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is also based here in Geneva, has developed methods to calculate what are those minimum essential levels of investments that government should take in order to prevent those human rights violations, which basically means in plain language that when a human rights violation is pervasive or prevalent, it should be prioritized in state budgets, and then there are some ways of calculating, as I say, to decide, okay, is there money going to other areas which should be devoted to address those minimum essential levels of a right. That's one thing. The second thing I wanted to say is about humanitarian action. The big problem we're finding with humanitarian action, GBV, gender-based violence, and sexual and reproductive health, for instance, the needs of pregnant women to have access to health care, is that humanitarian action is normally driven by the idea of funding life-saving needs. The available funding should go to meet those needs that save lives immediately. So both UN Women and us, UNFPA, we have been doing a lot of advocacy work to emphasize the centrality of GBV prevention and response in humanitarian settings, as well as access to healthcare for women in humanitarian settings, or access to contraception, if you want, as life-saving needs. I mean, still there's something, talking about mental cultures, there's something there that still needs to be broken. Why? Because in a humanitarian settings, the needs of women are given less value or less priority than the general needs of the population. And that includes gender-based violence and access to healthcare. What we are emphasizing is the need to integrate gender-based violence prevention and response in humanitarian preparedness and response plans. They have to be at the core of those plans, and for them to be also at the core of those plans, women's participation is fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you. We have also a comment from Mrs. Jabre, Mrs. Quinones, and Mrs. Leoni.
Sorry, I already spoke, but I want to make the link with who takes the decisions, who prioritizes, how are these decisions taken. And this is where I come back to political will, and again, the decision makers and where the power lies. And this brings me back to the importance of inclusive decision making processes, to making sure that women are part of the discussions, that they are represented in parliament, that they are in politics, that they have a say, and that civil society as well is part of those processes. I mean, this is the big picture, and it's easy to say, but who takes those decisions? Because it's not about getting more money, which is really challenging. It's about priorities and.
Mm-hmm. Priorities, Mrs. Leoni?
I think we're on the same line. I think if I take the concrete case of Norma, and especially the situation in Mexico, I mean, a way really to solve this impunity is really political will. I mean, somebody has to say, yes, now we're going to stop killing women, and somebody has to say, we're going to enforce our laws. Because I think it's I mean, the case of having more laws doesn't really help if they're not enforced. And I think really concretely in the case that I've been working on, it's really impunity and how you solve that. Somebody at the federal level or the state level has to take action and do something, and putting the people who are murdering women in jail. Full point.
Political willingness and funding. Mrs. Quinones, what is your opinion on that?
Yes, I want to share a few aspects related to this. First, we just finished the Commission on the Status of Women, which is on financing for gender equality. I invite everyone to read the agreed conclusions around the CSW of this year, and it's part of the conversations of the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future, and how to make sure we're implementing these commitments. It's not only to reach the agreed conclusions at the global level, and it's the same as if we have legislation and we're not implementing it. I think it's critical that we're understanding all the different aspects of lack of access to credit, lack of support for women's economic independence, the whole cycle of what needs to happen for women to be able to leave a relationship of violence and be protected, the quality of services that doesn't have re-victimization. But also at the core of this is the sustaining gender equality, making sure that we're evaluating national action plans. Most countries, 90% of countries around the world have domestic violence legislation, national action plans, but we're not necessarily evaluating those policies, so that's critical. And then also ensuring that we're sustaining what we have. The CEDAW committee, the CEDAW convention is really at one of the best tools that we have, looking at every aspect, the recommendations that come out. We're now close to the 40th recommendation, which is on women's participation and leadership, and the importance for women's voices to be included in policy making, but also in understanding budgets and the impact that they have over citizens. So to me, sustaining, defending, upholding what we already have will help us get into that cycle of ensuring the protection of women and girls in all the aspects of their lives. So rather than discussing a new convention, I would like to invite everyone to look at the ways in which we can sustain what we have, implement at country level. And we also work very closely with UNFPA and of course other agencies on the universal periodic reviews, providing recommendations to member states. What we need is implementation and showcasing those, the effects that these recommendations have had. So we have all the tools, and what we need is to have a conversation around implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, there are three questions. So let's start with you.
My name is Christiane Bertium. I'm a journalist and work as well with the UN, with Luisa, among others, and Brigitte. And it's more a comment. I've been lucky enough to see Brigitte's documentary, which is a very good one and very interesting and very touching. I mean, it comes really to the bottom of your heart about what happened to this lady. I mean, she's been fighting. She's still fighting after 20 years. She put herself, her children, her grandchildren at risk. She was attacked, seriously wounded. And what fascinates me in a certain way, but it's very sad, is that it took so long. I'm not sure she wants the murderers to be put in prison. Probably she knows that in a few years they will be released, but she doesn't even know. I mean, yes, now she knows who the murderers of her daughter are, but nobody recognizes it. Maybe the American court, But after 10 years, that's long. And so all of you talk about the puzzle, and there are a lot of pieces. But wouldn't be the first piece is to make sure that justice is applied. I mean, that this poor lady, 20 years, nobody want to acknowledge who are the murderers.
And don't forget also it's 94% of the cases are punished in Mexico, in feminicide case.
So would you
94% or 95%, meaning that only 4% are actually condemned. So
corruption is at the base. And so should it be the first piece of the puzzle is to make sure that those governments are not corrupted and that they would do their job, do justice, at least to this lady.
Justice. What can governments and parliaments do in order to be sure that those women like Norma could have justice, or at least to be heard? I don't know if Adriana would like to say a few words on that. It's not only the question of name and shame, those countries, but the question of do they really have a political willingness in order to tackle that? And specifically, if we think of Mexico, does a change of president make a difference or not? Maybe Brigitte, you have lived in Mexico and you know the situation. And then Adriana maybe will follow up.
Well, I can say something on. Norma says, I've seen 5 presidents. Remember that everything started in 2001. So she saw 5 presidents, many governors, many prosecutors, and at the end. Yes, after Fox in 2004-05, there were many changes because, yes, they have now infrastructure, institution, but as I said, the law is not enforced. Mm-hmm. So that's the main issue. So we need stronger political will. I hope that the new president will be acting in this sense, right? But I think probably in Mexico it's a different situation because they have an issue with violence, not only against women, it's also against men. They have also, a lot of, problems, insecurity problem and violence that are related to, cartel, drugs, and I think it's a different situation probably in Mexico compared to other countries, But as I said before, Mexico is equipped with a lot of laws and it's, quite advanced compared to other countries and continents. But I think it's really an issue of political will and education, and also, what we see also in Mexico, thanks to those women, as Adriana was saying at the beginning, thanks to the women, the mothers, we have advanced as well. Otherwise, nobody would have probably would have given her or them any chance, any access to justice. But the women took to the street and they went there and for many years, they demand justice, and at the end they got some kind of justice. But, I think it's too late as well because we need to do that before they are actually killed. So there are a number of things that should be done before, and I think this is probably the work that you're doing now. It's also to prevent, which is essential. And education, because when I talk to sometimes people in Juarez, they say, you are interested in those feminicides, but we're not anymore. I'm not talking about everybody. A lot of people are interested, but I'm talking about certain journalists that were saying to me, because now in Mexico you have 3,000 feminicides per year, more or less on average, because it doesn't stick to Ciudad Juarez. He went to all over, and Mexico actually now is the state where there are more. The Mexico state is the state where more women are killed. So,
Adriana, when we speak about justice and political willingness, you at UN Women, how do you foresee that? Do you have the impression that the heads of government, states, parliamentarians, and others have this political will, or is it just lip service? Do you really see a difference
But the problem is too big. And we have tackled only the punishment, but we need to create conditions for gender equality throughout the life cycle. And so this is what we are working on continuously with data, with studies, with evidence to really increase the investments where it matters. What UN Women did during the COVID pandemic was to document what worked for governments that responded in a better way to the needs of women and girls. And what they saw is where there's a strong women's movement, you had much more accountability. The women were closer to government authorities, demanding the services that were responding to the needs that they had. So this is why it's so important that UN Women and other UN agencies are working to really increase the voices of women in humanitarian settings, as what Alfonso was mentioning, but also that we provide resources to women's organizations at the grassroots level in decision-making. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda makes a pledge for women participating in peace processes, in peace dialogues, in transitional justice. And this is how we start to create a culture where women's voices are heard, where we are really being able to increase the accountability, and that only happens with a strong civil society movement, with strong female politicians that are the ones that will create the conditions. And, you know, I think most countries are making the first effort, but we need, this is an issue of services, also of responding, of coordination. For example, a woman is a victim, is a survivor of violence and goes to the police the first time, then goes to the health center the next time. Are these services connected to look at the risk factors so that second time there's a report by this same person, she gets all the protection needed? I think Uruguay has developed a system of protections with bracelets and really tagging the perpetrator, how close they are to the victim. Those are extreme measures, but they are needed. And they are sending the message, we will not tolerate this violence. So my final pledge will be that all these programs and these investments that we have been able to work on are for the longer term. We are expecting changes within 2 or 3 years, and that's not going to happen. What we need are investments for the long term. What we need is a vision of sustaining the gains in terms of definitions, in terms of institutions, and many times we're just giving up, and we have to be demanding the services constantly. This is what people like mother leaders like Norma teach us, that we have to be holding governments to account, increasing our participation in things that matter the most to us. I would hope that it's not in such tragic circumstances, but it demonstrates that one person can make a difference. And if we are all understanding the complexity of gender inequality and bringing efforts together to increase the life of women and girls in all of the different aspects, to be supported, to be protected, to be enhanced, then we can really tackle this issue.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions here. Lara.
Thank you. I'm an Italian journalist, and I think there's a very big problem here that we don't have numbers. Like even in Switzerland, I'm not talking about states with a really ineffective administration, but even in Switzerland, you don't have a data on how many feminicide, not only violence on women, but you don't have data on how many feminicide there are. And how can we create an SDG about women if we cannot measure the results we are trying to obtain? So even for me today it's complicated. I have to go back to a male chief editor and telling him I want to write an article on feminicide, but I don't have a number to give him. So one of the excuses that are given openly, even by the Swiss authorities, to the fact that they don't have data on feminicide is that it's difficult to be defined. So we see that, for example, some states define use data like homicide done by partners or family member, but this is not. This is just a part of feminicide because, and it's quite clear that if a woman is killed outside the domestic sphere and is raped or sexually assaulted, it's clear that it's a feminicide. So I want to ask you, can you help me giving a definition of feminicide that we can measure so that at least the states have something to start with if they want to measure this phenomenon? Thank you.
Who wants to respond to this question? Long question. Datas. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, Adriana?
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to mention our reports with UNODC that were mentioned at the beginning of this panel that are really defining how we record this, but it's again the importance of having specialized legislation. So this is what's important. There are some greater advancements in Latin America, and we have done comparative studies about this legislation, but also I will invite you to look at the studies that just came out late last year by UNODC and UN Women. And I'm very sorry, but I have to leave, but thank you so much for this invitation, and I hope we can continue this very important conversation. And just to say that there is data on femicides in Switzerland, and organizations like Soar Optimist International that are here organize events around combating femicide in Switzerland. So I hope they can also speak to these efforts in the time that's left. But I thank you very much for the invitation and hope to continue this discussion.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for your intervention. And maybe I can put you in contact with Lara. I can give Lara your email address so you can get in touch for more information.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. There is a last question here. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
yes, sir.
Yeah.
Please.
No, on the issue of data, but it's a pity that Adriana is leaving because certainly she knows this much better than me. Why? Because Latin America, again, has been a region at the forefront of this effort. Also in my country, in Spain, some countries have established observatories to track femicide, and they are using a number of parameters and criteria in order to define what is considered, how it should be considered femicide and how it should be measured. The problem we are facing, I think it's about 14 countries in Latin America. That's why I needed Adriana there, because I don't want to give you a wrong number. But definitely there's more than 10 countries in Latin America which have established these observatories. And the problem we are finding is that the issue of harmonization of standards and criteria and therefore the comparability of data. So I think that one effort that UN agencies and UN normative agencies in particular should undertake is to support the state in ensuring that harmonization of data so that we are all measuring the same. It's an emerging field. This issue, I mean, these observatories don't have a very, very long life, but I think time has come to make this type of investment. Thank you.
Just I wanted to add something because, I mentioned the journalists before, but I mean, data, especially in Mexico, were first provided by journalists, actually, They were taking all the cases and keeping the cases. And I think the journalists have been doing a great job in Mexico, and sometimes they were even putting their life at risk, and some have been killed as well. So what I was saying before, I was not criticizing the journalists, because obviously without them, nothing would have happened, really, especially in the context of Mexico. What I was referring to is that, there are so much violence, so many issues there that sometimes, feminicide is not the priority. But I mean, many organizations and journalists have been working on that, and without them it would have been impossible actually to map the feminicide in Mexico. So I pay homage to them because I think it's the great job that they have been doing.
Thank you. And your job also, because you are a journalist too. There is a last question here.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Riyad Bazia. I am an international correspondent for some TV satellite channels. I'm working with the UN since a while anyway. I did short term as a consultant and on behalf of civil society also. So you raise some interesting cases, very interesting, but those cases are not comparable between each other. But one case, it's a better case on feminicide. If we see it happened somewhere in another country, but we can understand that scenario have been established since the beginning, and scenario ran as they wishes. Finally, it used to be condemnation only for 8 years, and maybe there was some permissions, and just a few years, he can come back to his own country. Finally, just the half of the condemnation, 4 years, and he's free. But those cases, but it is public personality, but we should understand that there is complicity, and complicity, even if there were compensation for members of family, but there was some members of the family didn't accept compensations. But we should understand that there is a complicity. But who make the laws? Laws and legislation, it is on behalf of those parliamentarians. Parliamentarians, when they come in International Parliamentary Union, they are very happy to be in Switzerland, but it is very interesting for them to exchange expertise like that. And IPU, they are doing also survey for women gender since many years. But to arrive to my question, yes, because nowadays, my question is, how women empowerment can be a tool to ban, to reduce feminicide. We see, for example, yes, UN Women established since some years, but UNDP exists already. But to establish UN Women, it means UNDP exclude women? No. If we see, for example, the first woman who is to be the leader of UN Women, she used to be also the first woman president in his own country. And she used to be the first woman president in the geographical region. And she came back to Geneva, she became High Commissioner for Human Rights. But nowadays we see how much women empowerment, it is recognizable everywhere in the leadership international organizations. But it is interesting to, I will be happy to hear your answer, reflection nowadays. But we can still think about that, women empowerment as a tool to reduce or to ban feminicide.
Thank you for this long question. I think it's referring to maybe you, Mrs. Kareen Jabre. What can women parliamentarians do? Do they have a role? Do they make a difference?
So 20 years ago, the IPU carried out a research on the impact of women in parliament. And if you have women in parliament, what does it change? And so what we realized 20 years ago is that one of the first things that a significant amount of women in parliament can do is change the priorities of discussions in parliament or bring to the fore new topics. And the first topic that women MPs brought to the fore was domestic violence. Mm-hmm. It's the first thing that they brought, because of course when you are in a parliament with only men, it's not their reality, domestic violence. When you bring in women and they start having a voice, then they shift a bit the themes and the priorities that you need to discuss. It doesn't mean that they have the power to change everything, because women in parliament, or empowered women more generally, still face a lot of obstacles to change the rules that have been existing for so many years in all these institutions. And for me, I think the shift that we're seeing and that we're promoting within the IPU is that the advancement of women and combating violence against women or gender inequality or discrimination should not be the responsibility of women alone. It's not the responsibility of women in Parliament alone to do that, and it's the shift towards more of building gender-sensitive institutions and accountability for the whole institution as a whole to deliver on gender equality. Because as we all said, this is it's a societal priority, it's a human rights priority, it's an economic priority, and so it is the responsibility of everyone. And I think by opening the space for more inclusive decision-making processes, we are reaching a more sustainable investment and effort, again, towards more gender equality.
Thank you very much. Isabelle, would you like to have the last comment, maybe?
Yeah, on this, I wanted to say that the World Bank in the past few years, and specifically our project, has been able to inform many countries on the status of women's rights, in particular when it comes to an area that for countries is important, which is economic empowerment, that for countries can lead to an improvement in their productivity and increase in their GDP. In fact, our study has shown that where there is more gender equality in general, there's not only women benefit from this, but it also creates economies that are stronger and more resilient. So we have many examples of countries with whom we've worked and advised in order to equalize their laws and also adopt. This also includes the adoption of a legislation on violence against women. But as some panelists have said before, it is not just that. It's about creating an equal playing field in all areas. For example, there are still about 50% of countries around the world that do not mandate equal remuneration for work of equal value, and even less countries that have mechanisms to ensure that. And there are still countries that have unequal inheritance rights for husbands and wives, sons and daughters. So we see also in the area of pensions, there's inequality in laws. Different types of discrimination in the workplace are still not prohibited. In marriage, there's still a lot of discrimination in many countries. So it is important to address all those areas because, as we said, those are conducive also to an increase in gender inequality in countries that then, can also result in increased levels of violence against women. So I would like to invite you also to take a look at our data because there's many ways in which I think we can tackle violence against women and, through different approaches. And just concluding by saying that, it is important to continue working on this. And as many people said, and as many panelists said, I think we can come all together to, make sure that governments, CSOs, the private sector are aware of this, of the economic impact also of gender-based violence, which we have seen that when we work with governments, they really pay attention to that aspect in particular. While we do emphasize that it's a human rights issue, making the economic case for gender equality and explaining that it is smart economics also can bring really farther away. So that would be my conclusion.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Mr. Barragues, you have also a last comment on that. And by the way, it's very important, you have mentioned Spain. I think Spain maybe can be a case where there is a real political will in order to combat violence against women and feminicide.
Definitely, no, it's a country that has been cited by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and other human rights mechanisms as a good model, no, with the adoption in 2004 of the Integral Law on Gender-Based Violence and other laws that have promoted the right to bodily autonomy. But actually what I wanted to mention is partly related to that. And of course, I fully endorse what has been said about women's participation and women's participations in politics, not only as a right in itself, but as a way to ensure that women's agendas are at the center of the political debate, but also that men gradually take more responsibility on these issues. However, I just wanted to add an element of nuance that we shouldn't be losing sight of the current pushback against women's rights and gender equality. And what this means in practical terms is that women's bodies are becoming the battleground of those political debates. I think it's very important not to lose sight of that. Why? Because you may be seeing women in position of power who are the voice of certain conservative ideologies, which are even countering or undermining the political will that should be there to fight against gender-based violence or to fight against gender inequalities. No? So I think it's important to be mindful of that, that not only we need parity in terms of women's participation in the political space, but we also need to be very firm in terms of the politicization of women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Isabelle, for being with us. Thank you, Kareen. Thank you, Brigitte. Thank you, Alfonso. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation today in the room, and also thank you all the people who are connected with us. Thank you very much, Tobias. Also, you can find the link of this panel on the Press Club website. So let's keep in touch. There is a lot more to say and to exchange. Thank you very much for your participation. Bye bye. Thank you. Merci, mesdames et messieurs. Et puis, à très bientôt.